Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Roleplay Chat. I'm Matt, a game master who cannot stop talking about role-playing games. I hope everybody had a fantastic week, and I have a super exciting episode for you all today. So today's episode, we're talking about mega dungeons, how to build them, how to plan for them, and how to run them in a way that's interesting for all play types, whether that be people who prefer narrative games or people that prefer combat-heavy or intrigue-heavy games. So this is going to be an episode not to miss. And in our indie showcase, we are talking about Delver. Delver is a dungeon exploration game. It's kind of reminiscent of the old school systems where, there's a lot of looting enemies, a lot of dungeon delving, and a lot of very high lethality combat. So stay tuned for that around the 50-minute mark. We talk about Delver, a game by Hexplore Publishing. And yeah, without further ado, let's dive right into today's episode. I hope you all enjoy it very much. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Roleplay Chat. I'm Matt, a game master who cannot stop talking about role-playing games. In today's episode, I am eager to be covering a topic that I'm actually kind of unfamiliar with. So it's gonna be a fun one. I'm gonna poke and prod and ask a lot of questions because we're gonna be covering mega dungeons, something that I think goes back to the roots of D&D first edition or advanced Dungeons and Dragons, really, and the role playing games before it. And today I'm joined by an artist, a gamer, a map maker, blogger, YouTuber, the force behind the Red Quills Commission Cartography Company. Please join me in welcoming Ryan O'Connor to Roleplay Chat. Ryan, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm very excited.
Yeah. I'm excited to talk to you too, Ryan. I discovered you a little while ago where you made a video about mega dungeons on YouTube, and I thought it was a really, really insightful video. It was a topic that had always kind of been intriguing to me. These mega dungeons, these massive, massive, self-contained environments. But I was always too scared to run one myself. Um, so it was really fun to watch that video and see your breakdown. Anyway, that's what inspired me to reach out to you, which what inspired me to have this conversation with you, because I think I'm not alone in wanting to run a mega dungeon, but being perhaps a little afraid by how daunting it might seem. I don't know if
Oh,
that
absolutely.
resonates with you.
Oh no, I completely get it. I've been a dungeon master, game master for oh god, 10 years now. On and off in different games. Dungeons and Dragons is my first and primary love, but there have been others as well. And of course, I started in the overworlds,
Mhm.
homebrews doing stuff. Occasionally, I did modules, and I was also a bit leery of doing mega dungeons because it's something that I think any of us feel as dungeon masters could get really boring really quickly,
Mhm.
and it feels very generative, very video game esque. To kind of go into a dungeon and spend session after session after session just exploring room after room after room. So there is that pressure to create something that is interesting and dynamic and continually curious for our players, and that can be a lot of pressure.
Yeah, definitely. You also don't have, or at least I get the impression anyway, that you don't have the same, escape hatches that you might in an overworld game. You can't just have some random NPC that the party's met before come in and give them a new quest or interrupt what's going on because they're 20 floors underground. You have to, you have to kind of stick with the environment that you're in. But maybe that's an assumption that I'm making. And so I'm hoping we can dissolve some of these mysteries for me today, Ryan. So for our conversation, I'm hoping to kind of cover three main pillars of discussion. The first one is going to be kind of just like defining what a mega dungeon is, covering
Mm.
some of the basics of starting off when you're just getting pen to paper to start creating your own mega dungeon.
Yeah.
The second pillar is more of the advanced stuff, I would think, and that's really filling in the blanks and putting in more detail and really fleshing out the more, the minutia, let's say, of the mega dungeon.
Mm.
And then this last section is going to be more about advice or recommendations or your experience as it pertains to running the mega dungeon. Whether that
Yeah.
be your own or something that exists already, like a module or what have you. But yeah, so that's kind of my game plan for today. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a good way to break it down.
All right, sweet, 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 sweet. Well, then maybe before we do all of that, let's have you just give a little bit of context, like a brief amount of context to the listeners of Roleplay Chat. You know, who you are as a content creator, perhaps, the kinds of role playing games that you like to play, whether they're narrative or combat focused. And kind of give
Mm.
us some foundational stuff so that we can put into context the advice and stories you're going to be telling us today.
Oh, absolutely. All right. As you mentioned, Matt, I run the Red Quills, which is a quite a young YouTube channel. We make tutorials on how to create fantasy maps for your fantasy role playing games. That's really what our focus is. It's the maps part of it, because of that, we do talk quite a lot about how to create things like
Mm-hmm.
dungeons and castle and adventures, how to explore world building and things like that. I I just love playing role playing games. I have done for a very very long time. The escapism is it's just top tier for me. At the moment, I'm currently running a Dungeons and Dragons Fifth Edition campaign, which is the basis for a lot of the maps that I make on the Red Quills. We've been doing that for this campaign's 4.5 years long at the
Awesome.
moment, about 100 sessions, which is a marathon effort to my players, and it's been
And to
the
you, I'm sure.
oh and that as well,
Yeah.
but it's been a great opportunity to explore a lot of the more experimental ideas in Dungeons and Dragons and role playing games to try out new kind of concepts. Like for instance, I wrote Prophecy that we've been trying to fulfill for the last 40 odd sessions, which has been really really interesting to run it and to play it. But I suppose I would say then that my methods, I try to bring combat into it as well. But I love the role play and I love the puzzle side of it, but not like small puzzles, not just riddles and things. I'm talking large scale, multi session, trying to figure things out.
Mhm.
I try to create a sandbox world that you can go in any direction, you can explore what you want. Although I am a great believer in the concept of consequences. So if you have a quest lead and you decide not to pursue it, then that is absolutely hunky dory. It will resolve itself without you.
Mhm. That's it. Something's gonna happen. The
Which
world
I think
moves on.
it does. It
Yeah.
has its own life to it, and some things, we it's an ongoing source of paranoia for my players. It's because several times over the past, let's say, 10 sessions, they've come across a plot thread that they picked up and abandoned some 20, 30 sessions before, and they've only just now realized the kinds of consequences that has. And I think that kind of play really lends itself to something like a mega dungeon. Bring it back around to this topic, because it could be very, very easy just create a generative dungeon. You just create specific layers, and you kind of go in, you hit people, you bonk them, and then you get out again. But um, being interested in creating a narrative that you can explore, I think is the heartblood of what makes a mega dungeon interesting, which
Mhm.
is why we're all here. We're all here to just be interested, I think, at
Yeah,
the end of the day.
definitely. And it sounds like, that's definitely a way to scratch that exploration, that itch of exploration, that itch of problem solving, putting together
Mm.
environmental context. I think that Yeah, a dungeon is an interesting way to story tell uh, because of its limitations. I find, putting together a set, even if it's not a mega dungeon, but putting together a set of 10 to 20 rooms can tell a really interesting story within the confines of just that. So I'm curious to see if the mega dungeon opens any new possibilities up. Uh, so awesome, awesome. That sounds great. And I didn't know that history about Red Quills. So that's really interesting too. I guess you guys started off with the commission maps and then the YouTube channel. Was that perhaps like a side venture that came together to showcase the maps that you were creating, or how did that work out?
You know what? That's a fun question because I'm not sure I've got an answer for you. It just it just kind of happened. The idea of the Red Quills has been rattling around for a little while. It's actually it's called the Red Quills because that's the Cartographers Guild in the world that I run.
Okay,
Because I've
cool.
always loved making maps, and occasionally the players would be like, "Oh, we need a map of this place," and I'd be like, "Great, go and visit the Red Quills. They're in the capital. You can go and buy a map from them." And that'd give me some time while they got there to
Yeah,
sort of draw
definitely.
up a little map for them. But yeah, I did a couple of commissions, and then someone said, "Hey, how do you do it? How do you what's your how do you make your style happen? What tools do you use? That kind of stuff." And I said, "Oh, I'll make a quick video," and I did in January, and then I made another one, and
Here we are.
we've
Yeah.
been going. Yeah, we've been going for a little while now. The Mega Dungeons video got something like 42,000 views,
Awesome.
which is amazing. Yeah, I'm uh, very blessed to have had that audience, um, and it's just kept growing, which is great.
Cool. Cool, cool, cool. Well, folks, there'll be a link to Ryan's YouTube channel and to the Red Quills website in the show notes. So make sure you go check that out. And I definitely, especially within the context of Mega Dungeons, that video I think does a fantastic job of summarizing, the steps you can take to get started. So I think between our conversation today and Ryan's video, you should have everything you need to get started and make a Mega
Touch
Dungeon
wood.
and run it.
Touch
Pardon
wood.
me.
There's always more to say in
Uh-huh.
on a specific topic than I can in a video because each of the videos that I make are somewhere between 20 and 25 minutes long, generally speaking, which is sounds like a lot of time. And I talk almost constantly throughout that 25 minutes. You might get sick of the sound of my voice, but it's just you can't cram everything into it. And there are any number of comments in given videos saying, "Oh, you didn't talk about this, or you didn't talk about that." So if you do have questions, I'm always free to chat in the comments, and I have promised Mega Dungeons 2
Okay,
more
cool.
Mega in
More
the future.
more
Yes,
dungeon, more mega.
more
That's
dungeon, more Mega.
just more of everything. Awesome, awesome. Well, I think we've been dancing around the mega dungeon for quite some time now. So let's dive right in and talk about mega dungeons. And I think the first question we have to ask ourselves, Ryan, is what's a mega dungeon?
Oof, great question. You wouldn't think that this is as controversial as it is, because so many people on the internet have an opinion about this. But listeners, I've done a great deal of research on this. There is no one definition of what a mega dungeon is. So I will say for this that a mega dungeon is whatever your heart tells you. But in this particular case, you're generally referring to a an underground complex that has several layers, several entrances, and several exits. The idea being that it's a self contained pocket of the world that you
Hmm.
can explore. It is not necessarily the same as a dungeon, which generally follows a certain level of steps. You come in, you've got the entrance hall, you've got a trap, you've got an encounter, you've got an environmental difficulty, and then you've got the conflict and the treasure at the end. That's the general line of thinking for a dungeon. A mega dungeon is because it's separate from the rest of the world and it's enormous, has to be explorable on its own. It doesn't necessarily have to have those specific steps, and certainly not in that order. So
Hmm.
it is a castle of a specific size is a mega dungeon. When you come to it from a specific point. But the way I always tend to think about it is in fantasy genre terms. So, for instance, Moria in the Lord of the Rings is a mega dungeon.
Mm-hmm,
You can't get much more mega than Moria. If it would take you at least 3 or 4 sessions to explore it, you've got your hands in a mega dungeon at that point.
Yeah. I really like that. And I think for me, the part that's key is scale, of course, and this kind of sense of isolation. It needs to be, for me anyway, it needs to be self-contained. It needs to be
Mm.
its own sort of ecosystem that plays with itself. Um, I always think of like Dark Souls dungeons. To me, that's a mega
Yeah.
dungeon. Like this long, deep, cavernous system, or this huge castle, or maybe something floating in the sky, like an island floating in the sky that's isolated. You have a few entry ports or whatever. Um,
But for the most part, is almost entirely self-contained.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's it. And I think we could go so far as to talk about like sci-fi mega dungeons too. I'm not too big in the world of sci-fi, but I've played some interesting games. Not too long ago, I played a game of Mothership, and that was a mega dungeon. We played a one shot in a mega dungeon, and we all died like 3 floors down. But
Classic.
it was this big abandoned AI um, like complex. It was a complex that was
Yeah.
making like robotic AI like creatures, and there were all these different floors for like the different elements of the robot and stuff. And anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great example of it actually, because I think the idea of a dungeon, calling it a mega dungeon, puts us in mind of dank underground tombs, but it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't necessarily need to be that. I think a space station is a really good example of a mega dungeon because it has that scale. But there are a lot of things that people are like, oh, it has to have this, it has to have that, which isn't necessarily the case. Mega dungeon doesn't need to have several, floors, doesn't need to have several levels. It doesn't really necessarily need to have multiple entrances and exits. It is just a pocket of the world or a different kind of environment that is completely cut off from everything around it that you can explore, that has a story, that isn't just go in, chop everything down, get out again.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and that kind of leads me into my next question, Ryan, is when you start thinking about a mega dungeon,
Mm.
what's kind of the first thing that people ought to consider? Is it this kind of narrative purpose? Is that kind of the right spot to start? Is that where you start?
I'm going to sound like an English teacher now, and I regret that. I regret that deeply. But honestly, the first thing you should be thinking about is your theme. What's the theme of the dungeon? God, I hate this.
You have to go
But let's
find
okay.
like your grade 12 English teacher and send them this.
And,
And
oh
just
no, no,
no,
no, no!
you're
I'm
not
going to
gonna do it.
go and drown myself in a toilet after this just to balance it out. Well, no. So, look, if you're a dungeon master or a game master, whatever it is, and you are having your session zero, for instance, you sat down with your players and you say, okay, this is what I'm thinking of running. It's going to be mostly combat with a little bit of role play, a little bit of puzzle solving. And, they say, oh, that's great. I've got this character who is an exiled samurai. I
Mm-hmm.
want to be a fairy princess. I want to be I don't care what it is, but I want a horse. So on and so forth. Everyone's going to have their own kind of starting basis. And you say, okay, great. I can take those concepts and I want to write a story about legacy. And your players will go, oh, that's great. That sounds great. I don't really know or care what that is. I'm going to get to bot people. But if you start off with that, you say, okay, legacy, that's going to give you a really good starting point for your mega dungeon. If it is legacy, then you can do what I did in mega dungeon video. It is, the buried palace of a once great empire. You've got different levels which represent different kinds of legacy. You've got tombs to represent, a legacy of death. You've got, armories or arenas to represent the legacy. You've got, the palace itself, which represents the legacy of grandeur and majesty and all those kinds of things. And you can have different levels of your mega dungeon, explore different parts of that theme.
Mm-hmm.
And as you go through, you can tie it through to your individual characters' interests. An exiled samurai is going to be very interested in the concept of honor. A fairy princess is going to be very interested in the concept of fantasy and isolationism. Fairies are always very isolationist. Why not? A person who's interested in horses, give them the old stables. They'll have something interesting for them in there. It'll be great. But that's your starting point. Always ask yourself, what kind of story? You don't have to ask it, what's my theme? What kind of story do you want to tell? Is it a Western? Is it a horror? Is it a sci-fi? And then you can branch out from there.
Yeah. And I suppose having that kind of central theme definitely provides you almost like a structure, right? To help
Yeah.
inspire yourself. Because when we're looking at a mega dungeon, there's a lot that's going to go in this. It's going to be big. There's going to be, I mean, I hate to say a number because then people are going to quote me on it after, but let's say 100 rooms, like there's going to be about 100 rooms in this thing, maybe less, maybe more, but let's say 100 rooms. That's a lot of stuff to fill in. And if you don't know where you're going with it, it's going to be difficult for you to find inspiration, I think, in telling kind of a uniform story. I like your example too of having this like old empire, because you've got a lot that you can work with there. You have a lot of legacy that you can consider. And I think it gives you a sense of what the space would have been used for, right? It gives you this kind of barometer. You can measure, you can say, okay, this was an old empire underground. They needed to survive here somehow. So they must have had a place where they could farm or create subsistence and things like this. Or they must have had a place to sleep, or they must have had a place to entertain themselves. So it kind of gives you this springboard to start thinking about your dungeon at kind of at a deeper level. But cool. So we've got our theme. We've got hopefully some kind of purpose or intention behind the utility of the space. What about like its layout? What about the way the dungeon is going to be interwoven together? That to me
Yeah.
feels like a maze within itself. Where do you start
It's
when you do that?
I always start big and work smaller. So
Okay.
for instance, if I've sat down and I said, okay, this is what my theme's going to be. These are the individual concepts that I think will be interesting to the characters and that they can do it. Let's say I've got 4 characters. I've got 4 different sub themes. I'm going to be like, okay, cool. We'll keep things tidy, and I'll have 4 different levels within, let's say 5 even, because we'll have one for each of the characters, themes, and then another one which is going to be the big bads.
Okay, cool.
On each of
Yeah.
those levels, I'll make some big rooms, and those rooms will be determined by what the excuse for the mega dungeon is. So the theme is why I've built it. The excuse is, it's a palace, which is great. That's interesting and it's explorable, and you can find that dynamic in a specific way. But it really is just an excuse for me to shovel these rooms together. But the excuse will give me, if it is a palace, it needs a throne room. It has to have one. If it's a palace, it needs to have an entrance hall. It needs to have living quarters. It needs to have somewhere where the soldiers can gather. It needs to have, I have an arena because that's where they had their, entertainment happening. And there are other things that you can always add in as well. Places that make sense to be in a palace that you can find purpose for as a dungeon master. For instance, baths. Baths are a great short rest area. Love baths. They're great. And you can have things coming out of the pipes as well. Wonderful. But if you make those the big rooms, let's say that the throne room is the big room on the middle layer, so the 3rd layer out of 5, then that's the focus of it. You can connect that So the layer above and the layer below. And then around that, create a web of rooms that you can give function afterwards once you've connected all the major rooms. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Would you advise that somebody do this kind of approach where they have their mega dungeon in mind, they have a theme in mind, and you make like you would recommend perhaps, or would you recommend coming up with 5 or 6 of these almost like these cinematic centerpiece rooms, and then build the rest of the mega dungeon outside of that kernel? Would that be a way to do it then?
I think that's how I tend to do it.
Okay.
Yeah, I find
Yeah.
that it's a good that's a jumping point for me to think about what's inside the mega dungeons rooms themselves. In
Yeah.
the video, I go into the method. I have a little bit more as well. So there's an old dungeon generation method which says there's 5 different kinds of rooms, and they are ambience, environmental danger, puzzle, trap, and conflict. I
Hmm.
think off the top of my head,
Something like that.
and
Yeah.
that's something up like that, and that's a good kind of springboard to start your ideas. If you've got these big ambient rooms, like they lend themselves automatically to being, battle areas.
Hmm.
Throne room, very powerful area to have a battle. Obviously, you're going to be like, oh, obviously, we're going to have a big conflict with the big bad in the throne room on the throne, amidst the statues of the long dead kings. That's great. That's obviously going to happen. And then around that, you're like, okay, well, I need to have an ambience area, which is just they can go through it and they can look for history, but they can also take a rest there. There is an environmental danger because that makes it interesting to maneuver your way through the dungeon. There
Hmm.
are traps and puzzles and patrols going through the old halls. And so what I tend to do is I do tend to work off that on each of, if I've got 5 levels and each of them has a different theme, they'll all have one major room and let's say 5 distinct areas on each level. Each of those areas has the broad theme of being ambient, of being a puzzle, being a trap, or having an environmental danger, being, conflict or something. And then within those, they've each got smaller and smaller rooms. So if it's on the palace level, the ambient area could be the baths. The conflict area could be the old, bed chambers, which are still being guarded by ancient automatons, and so on
Hmm.
and so
Hmm.
forth. And so you break it down further and further and further. And in that way, if you've got 5 levels, each of those have 5 sections, each of those sections have 5 chambers, you've got 124 chambers
There you go.
right there.
Yeah.
Uh,
That's awesome.
and so
That's
that's
awesome.
that's a really great way of just generating ideas very, very quickly, because once you've got the bare bones of it, you can flesh things out a little bit more. You can add a little bit more
Yeah.
to.
Yeah. 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 That's really cool. Before we keep going, let's hear a quick message from Luke over at Limithon Press about his upcoming Kickstarter that actually launched yesterday, September 7th. It's a Pirate Borg Morkborg expansion called Down Among the Dead. Let's give it a quick listen before we jump back to today's interview.
Welcome, drowned souls and shipwrecked mariners, to the locker. The lost meander here. The chains that bound them to the corporeal world rust and crumble as they sink deeper and deeper into the void. Perhaps there is a chance for you. Perhaps you will escape the endless waters of purgatory and return to the realm of the living. Perhaps you might reclaim the feeble carnal existence you once loathed. Or perhaps, more likely, you are now one of the many, down among the dead. Pirate Borg, down among the dead.
It's funny that you talk about the 5-room principle, because I think it was about 2 years ago, or close to 2 years ago, we recorded an episode on the show about 1-room dungeons, or like small dungeons, like
Yeah.
2 or 3 rooms. And I think we talk about that there too. And it seems to be a really practical way to organize the challenges that the party is going to face up against. And it kind of categorizes um, very neatly the things and obstacles and the rooms that you're going to find in the dungeon. And it makes it easier on you as a game master to make sure that you've kind of balanced things out by including just enough of this and just enough of that, and all of that. What about the way it's connected, Ryan? Like how much effort and energy do you put into having like branching paths and many different ways to arrive to the same place, and think, like, do you think about that? I mean, you must, because when you put it down on pen to paper, um I'm getting philosophical here, but I wonder if we have to, or if that's something that we can kind of like fudge as we play.
No,
I don't know. I don't know.
it's a fair question. It makes me think. I did a mega dungeon, God, about 3 months ago, and the concept was it was a dragon's an ancient dragon's temple. The temples were
Hmm.
ancient, and the whole complex was in the shape of a dragon, um,
Cool.
looking at it from above. Yeah, so you had an entrance hall and a very long neck, and then body, two literal wings, legs, long tail. And for that, it was very clear there was only one way in and one way out, and it was for plot reasons for
Hmm.
me, because it was to do with this prophecy and all these kind but within it, obviously, if you're designing a mega dungeon and it wants a building, obviously they're going to have more than one way to get
Yeah.
from different rooms, because architecturally it would be an absolute nightmare for you to only have one path through the entire building. And so I ended up having, I think, two doors in each area leading to a different area. So you could navigate it, with the exception of the entrance and the exit, you could navigate them in any order,
Okay.
really.
Cool. Yeah.
Um, and I think that's a really good way of doing it architecturally speaking. And if you as a DM want to stop them or shepherd them, or, layer things in a specific way, if you leave the doors open but give them an obstacle that's not, you know, physical, in terms of like a closed door or a collapsed hallway, then there are ways in which you can cut off areas. For instance, a mimic door is one of my favorite ways to make an area impassable. Looks fine, looks like a normal door. And if people are getting desperate and they're looking for, someone to take a short rest, and they put their hand on a door and it turns into a mimic, then they're going to say, no, that's obviously a little bit too much right now, too much to unpack right there. We're going to go back the way we came.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so there are ways of cutting areas off that don't involve, chopping away doorways and stuff. I think that the more navigable an area is, and the more replayable an area is, the more interesting it's going to be for your players. Because a mega dungeon's draw is that it is its own world. Of course, it's not just a dungeon. You go in, you kill everything, and you come back out again. If you've gone through one specific area, which has 25 chambers, and you say, oh, we've taken a long rest in this chamber, and then you go back again, something will have happened. There is a community of lizard folk there, for instance.
Hmm.
They've reclaimed their dead, set up a barricade. I think that kind of adaptive environment is just as intriguing, if not more intriguing, than something that's static.
Yeah. Definitely. And actually, a couple of folks, I did some polls on both Twitter and Threads to see how people felt about mega dungeons, kind of broadly. Had they played them before? or had they played them before? Yes or no? And did they enjoy it, or do they want to try it? And I got some interesting questions from the community. One of which speaks exactly to this. It was Jack from Of Gods and Game Masters who mentioned that having the dungeon have its own ecology, and for that ecology to be reactive, is really important in the creation of a mega dungeon. But
Yeah.
it also is kind of one of the biggest challenges of running a mega dungeon. So I'm curious to see how we tackle that maybe a little bit later, Ryan. But there,
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
was another question that we got from the Dungeon Slime 27, and Dungeon Slime asks, or kind of goes on to talk about, they had run a dungeon before, a mega dungeon before, but their biggest challenge was that it kind of got boring.
Mm.
And I think this speaks a little bit to kind of the scale and the theme and these central rooms. So I'd be curious to know if you have advice for the Dungeon Slime or anybody else listening about what you can do to make the mega dungeons areas feel different enough and feel exciting, so that you don't kind of get into that like sludgy, okay, it's been 5 games, we're still in this place, like that feeling of wanting to just abandon it because it's boring.
Mm. That's always a tough one.
Mm-hmm.
How to keep things interesting is the eternal problem as a game master. I mean, not just in Mega Dungeons, but I think because of the way that Mega Dungeons are built, people expect, they are a really obvious way of losing your audience's interest because
Mm-hmm.
of what they are and how they're constructed. They're the same. They're just one chamber after another after another. And if you do that poorly, then yes, it can get very, very boring very, very quickly. And there are ways to get around it. Ramping difficulty is a great way of keeping stakes high. So if you have the early areas and it's a lot of traps and a lot of role play, you've got a little village of kobolds and you could fight them, but you can also try to negotiate them. And there's nothing more fun for me as a DM than trying to play a kobold who wants something or something.
Do you have a typical Cobalt voice that you do?
Oh, I have several kobolds. I have several kobolds that are recurring characters. One of them is Quent. Yeah, Quent, and he sells second-hand magical items and never really quite understands what the function of them is. So, for instance, he had a ring of tax evasion. He loves his ring of tax evasion. He wants 1,000 gold for his ring of tax evasion. It is a ring of evasion, so it's a pretty good item if you want it. But he is absolutely attached to his view of the world, and
That's cool.
I think that those kinds of characters are really interesting. They're really fun, and when you start a dungeon, I think never start with the danger. Never start with the danger. You want to start with the fun first and the intrigue of it. And you're like, oh, this is fun. This is hunky dory, and then about a fifth of the way through, then all of a sudden, show the danger. If you can almost kill one of them, great. That's what you want. Suddenly bring it back, remind them what the stakes of it are. As you go through, you're like, oh, that was a fluke. We weren't prepared. They're going to get better. They do a bit more combat, and it's a little bit more challenging, but they take it in stride. Then they go a bit further down, and they reach another kind of danger. It's not combat anymore. Suddenly, they can't find anywhere to sleep, ever.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime they try to take a rest, they fail to take a rest. And it could be like goblins or something. Whatever they're fighting isn't a challenge. It's not really hurting them, but it's death by 1,000 cuts. If they can't rest, they're going to take points of exhaustion. If they take points of exhaustion or levels of exhaustion, then they're going to really start suffering quite quickly. Then you start bringing the combat back again. You occasionally change things up by having a friendly face help them out as much as they can. If you want to kill the friendly face, just add some emotional stakes, then you do you, boo. Then you get to the end. And at this point, you want them to be desperate to leave. And the more you can give them throw them a rope, this is the way out, this is the way you can go, and be safe. You can finally escape to the world above. You don't have to suffer through this anymore. All you need to do is wander through this very large, very well-lit hall with no discernible, obvious bad guys in it. Just walk straight through. I promise nothing bad will happen. And of course, you have your big boss fight right then when they're desperate, when there's nothing else for them. And is that maybe?
Maybe.
Pardon me. And I think that kind of ramping difficulty, that danger is a way to keep them interested. But if you want my real opinion on how to keep people interested and not getting bored, then that is a question that you need to solve before you really start. That's a session zero question. Because if you find that they're getting bored, it's because their expectation is different to your expectation.
Mm-hmm.
And look, you can have nightmare players all the time. That happens if you're changing constantly. You don't really know your players very well. You don't know what expectations are. They have a different idea of what Dungeons and Dragons is to what you think it is. But if they are expecting what you're expecting, then they won't get it because they know what's more or less. They don't know the specifics.
Yeah, no, I think that's good advice. And I think there are ways that we've been talking about in building the mega dungeon that hopefully will help alleviate that, right? Having the set piece rooms in each of the floors or in each of the sections, and having each section kind of tell its own story about the location that you're in, that'll help. That'll definitely help, especially if you have players who are eager to uncover the secrets of the world that they're playing in. Having the difficulty ramp up, that's gonna hopefully engage the players who are more in it for fighting the monsters and keeping their HP up and like that kind of strategy. I think the next piece that I'm hoping to talk to you about, Ryan, is perhaps filling in that granularity, making sure that there are interesting things to engage with in every room, because every room should be engaging to a certain degree. How do you fill the dungeon? Like how do you put NPC, like where do you come up with all of that on the onset? Do you have like random tables that you use to populate NPCs and different kinds of things? Like how are you filling in all 125 rooms with something fun and interesting?
That's a great question, and it's something I ask myself constantly. And I think it's something that you continually learn to do. There's no end state to being like, oh, this is the best way to do it. I will never improve on this method. In the past, what I tended to do is have 3 layers to explore in any given dungeon.
Okay.
And not physical layers. There's like 3 kind of plot threads. One of which is the history of it, which is that, let's call it the archaeology of it. And that's what if you took out all of the inhabitants of the dungeon, all the bad guys, and you were an archaeologist, you would be able to find things that are interesting. You have to be able to find things that are interesting in the mega dungeon because that's your setting.
Mm-hmm.
If you walk through and you're like, oh, this chamber is exactly the same as the chamber before, same dimensions, same everything. It's got a mural on the wall. You can't read what it is. Moving. Then that is very boring. But more importantly, why was that room built in the first place? If it doesn't feel real to your players, then they're gonna lose their immersion pretty quickly, and you want to preserve that at all costs. So the first layer is the archaeology of it. Give each of your rooms a function. It doesn't have to be. You don't have to go super into depth with it. You can just label each of them. Okay, this is the old, guard dormitory. This is the guard kitchen. This is so on and so forth. Just 2 words is enough for you to say, okay, you go in. The guard kitchen is a long, low room, beams from the ceiling. You can see the rusting hooks hanging from the beams. Old strings connect them. In one of the rotting cupboards along the walls, you find an ancient Hessian sack, long since rotted away. Rats have made their domain in the dark places of this little kitchen. And even then, you can see a rusted kettle sitting on a stove that hasn't had a fire. That's enough of the physicality of the place for you to say, okay, that's a good basis. Now we're going to add some of the other layers. The next layer is, of course, the inhabitants. Who lives there when you're not there? and what do they do.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to the dragon-shaped mega dungeon, for instance, each of the wings had a different denizen. One area
Pulling out
was a
the
bunch.
A+ words there. That's a good one.
Yeah, oh, I love denizen. It really kind of puts you in mind of something creepy. One of the wings had a bunch of kobolds. It was a kobold tribe, and they worshipped the ancient dragon. Right. One of the wings had a group of lizard folk who drank the waters of the temple because they thought that it would give them draconic powers. Another area is a wizard had made his little uh, study there because he actually had an experiment that would turn him into a dragon flesh grafters from Fizban's Guide to Dragons.
Mm.
And he had his own little minions running around doing things. And then the last area had undead, just undead servants of the dragons and golems, things like that, non-living entities. So when the players aren't there, they had their own very complex turf war going on. And I think that is important for you as a dungeon master when you're planning it out. What happens when your players aren't there? Because if you can answer that question, what things normally look like, then it's going to feel so much more dynamic
Mm-hmm.
for your players. I would say don't populate individual rooms with living creatures. Don't say, "Oh, this is who you'll find in this room. This is who you'll find in this room." Instead, say, "This is the function that this room normally plays for this group of people." For instance, this chamber is where they grow their vegetables. This chamber is where they keep their livestock. Here is where they gather to have important meetings. This is where they live. This is where they keep the children, so on and so forth. Always have somewhere where they keep the children. That's just a note for me because you want to give your players moral dilemmas.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've got different areas and different functions for different areas, and you know the kinds of creatures that live in them, then just be aware of what the population is and any significant NPCs. And then you can populate them as you like. Because if you go into the vegetable area and they've been making a ruckus further down the corridor, then the kobolds inside may have heard them. And they've run off to tell everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And they've gathered everyone else from everywhere, all the other chambers. They put kids in the kids' chamber, and then they've set up a barricade. And then the environment responds to the players, which automatically makes things so much more interesting to them. They have to think about how they're proceeding from room to room to room. So that's the second layer. Who lives there when they're not there, and how do they respond to the players being there? And then the third layer I always tend to add to give them a bit of intrigue is a layer that's specific to them. Something or someone is hunting them or is there because of them. So I tend to bring that in much later on. It could be like a rival adventuring group. It could be an evil wizard. It could be whatever you want, but it's got to be non-indigenous to the dungeon, and it's got to be following them. So that if they make a mistake, then they are in definitive danger from something in particular. So those three layers, I think, are enough to give enough ambience to the players to keep them interesting. It's enough to give them enough enemies to keep them interesting, make them think about the tactics that they're using as they're going through the dungeon, and danger that is specific to them.
That's
really how cool. I do it.
I really like that. I really like that a lot. The more we talk about this, Ryan, I just keep going back to video games. I don't know why, but I feel like a lot of the like Metroid games, a lot of the Metroidvania style games, I think do quote unquote mega dungeons very well. In this same kind of idea, my brain is going to Hollow Knight. Have you played that one? The little bug.
I love Hollow Knight. I was just thinking about Hollow Knight. That's a great mega dungeon. It's the Hollow Knight map.
You've got the whole underground bug world that used to be something. Now it's something else, and it's filled with its own denizens, and they interact with one another, and they pose challenges to you, and then you have that, what's her name? There's someone chasing you around who's like trying to Hornet's trying to get you. So I love that. I love that, and it really gives you a lot to work with as a game master, because
it does.
You can almost cycle through those things in addition to cycling through. So you're going through a trap room. Oh, now you're going into a puzzle room. Okay, now you're going to a combat room. and you have these like knobs where you could say, you know what, in this room we're gonna twist the historic architecture up a little bit and give a clue
Yeah.
about that. Okay, the next room, I just gave them a clue about the history or the architecture, so now we're going to talk about the denizens that are here now, and you can kind of mix and match each of those, the 5-room dungeon things with the
Mm.
3 layers of complexity of the history of the place that you're in, and you've got a lot of different permutations that you can play with as a game master. Um, I really, really, really like the way that you said that you don't have people set in a room. And I think that might, I'm curious to know how the listeners of the show who are, a little bit more old school D&D feel about that. Because I feel like in a lot of the old modules, it tells you in room A, there is the zombie. In room B, there is the spider. In room C, there's the mimic or whatever. And it feels so unnatural. It feels so unnatural to have these creatures be like waiting for you to come into the room, like it just didn't make sense to me. And I suppose that there's always been instruction to like you can have them move around and you can have them set off alarms and gather reinforcements and whatnot, but yeah, no, I love it so much.
I played early on. I think one of my first introductions to Mega Dungeon was it Tales of the Yawning Portal? One of
Yes.
the modules for it's a 5e module now. But I think the Yawning Portal goes back to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It's an old one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um, and it was very much like that. You go into this chamber and you see these things around. This is what the difficulty is, of achieving these things, blah, 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 which is, when you're creating a module, I completely get that. You really need to be prescriptive, and it is a tool to help DMs to branch out from there. But it did feel very stale. It didn't feel like the dungeon would exist without us going there.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point, I was actually a player in it. I wasn't DMing it. I was playing it. And at one point, we fell down a bunch of levels accidentally. We failed the chance. Well, one of us did, and the others were like, we're all going together. So we all jumped down after him. And there was a black dragon at the bottom, which completely obliterated all of us because we were level 3 at the time. And this adult black dragon just took one look and killed us immediately, which is fair from a specific perspective because that's what the book said. But as a DM, as a player, that was very unsatisfying. And as a DM, there were many other options that could have taken place. If you wander into a black dragon's lair and you are absolutely no match for it, and the dragon knows that, then why would it bother killing
Mm-hmm.
you when it could send you on a fetch quest of its own? When it could, turn you against each other for its own
Yeah,
amusement. If
fascinating.
there's so many ways that you could play that out that I think a book doesn't allow you to explore properly, and that's why I would always argue for a dynamic world. Hollow Knight is a great example, fantastic example. I actually got the 3 layers of storytelling, so the ambient one, the historical one, the ambient one, and the personal one is from my observations of the Horizon games. Horizon
Cool.
Zero Dawn, love that game. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And so you explore the history, what happens to the original world, you explore the politics of the current world, and you explore her personal quest as well at the same time. And each of those is its own complete world to explore. And I adored that. I bring it into all of my games.
Yeah, I think it's a really solid piece of advice. And it makes me really wonder. I know I kind of like teased it earlier. I'm kind of obsessed with this idea of having a mega dungeon with blank space. And I'm sure that would be like a nightmare to game master. But to have elements of the mega dungeon be undecided to you as a game master, so that if something like this were to happen, if the players were to find themselves stumbling into an area, you have that flexibility of saying, well, you know what? I haven't figured out quite what this room is going to be yet, but I know that it's within the context of this area being the living quarters of the Black Dragon, and there would be a handful of different types of rooms that would fit that description and fit that purpose, but my party is way under leveled. Maybe I'm gonna make the room that they fall into. It's not going to be the treasure room. You know, like it's not going to be where the black dragon is sitting on the treasure waiting for them to fall. I'm going to give them the opportunity to save themselves or maybe hide or realize that there's a black dragon here. Let's mentally prepare ourselves for this encounter and see how we can get out of it if possible. But you know what? Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's take a quick break. We're going to have our indie showcase. So we're going to, cut to me and whoever it is that's being spotlighted this time in the indie showcase. I hope you guys enjoy it, and we'll be right back.
Hi there, Matt. Thanks for having me on the show. My name is Luis. I live in Brazil, and I'm the neurodivergent mind behind Hexplore RPG or Hexplore Publishing. Since English is not my native tongue, I had to write down the answers so I get everything right. I hope you don't mind that. Well, I'm here to talk about Delver. Delver is a classless, minimalist, OSR-flavored RPG. It's a D20 system, kind of the chassis of a D&D Rattle clone, but with a modified engine. It's a game of failed knights, fallen priests, dirty rotten scoundrels, and all sorts of ill-fated adventurers, fighting for survival in a greedy fantasy world. The name Delver is an acronym for Dungeon Exploration, Loot, Violent Encounters, Role-Playing. Basically everything you need for a good RPG game night. But Delver is also how normal people call those shady adventurers who delve into dungeons darker than their own souls in search of gold and glory. Delver is a very rules-light game that was born of my desire to come up with a concise system to run games for my players, combining bits and pieces of several other systems. It's very modular, and you can dial up and down some of the rules to adjust it to your own preferences. The inspiration for Delver came to me, and that's actually a funny story. You see, I was searching for public domain images to use in my adventures that I publish on DriveThru RPG, and all of a sudden I stumbled upon this amazing picture of a scared knight in plate mail descending a stone staircase, while a mad-looking mage tries to grab a mountain of coins, and a skeletal-looking tree leans over them. That image was so powerful and evocative that the idea for the whole game came to me in a flash, and I just knew I had to write it. So I challenged myself. Let's see if I can write this whole game in just 2 weeks. Initially, Delver would be a class system like D&D with a lot of classes. I mean, fallen priests, failed knights, scoundrels, witches. But to keep with the deadline, I decided to make it a classless game. All characters are just delvers, and that's all. In the future, I plan to add classes. I'm working on them, but for now, I'm having a blast with the game as it is. It's very modular and it's very flexible. Uh, I think the best thing about Delver are the combat rules. Combat in Delver is brutal. It's deadly as hell. In fact, it's so deadly, I had to give players and DMs optional rules for defense and damage to tone it down a little to a more old school D&D-like experience. Also, Delver has nice random systems for magic, combining verbs and nouns to create spells, and fast and fun random tables to generate treasure and monsters. I use these tables on my D&D campaign all the time. And it's really fast to create a character in Delver. I actually made a short video on my YouTube channel showing that you can generate a character in Delver in less than 1 minute. That's true. You can go there and check that out. I know that Delver is basically a collage of my favorite rules taken from a lot of different games and put together. Uh, but it's a fun and deadly fast rule system to try out, and I invite you to try it out. Uh, I don't know. Maybe Delver can inspire listeners to come up with new ways to do stuff in their own games. And I would love to hear from anyone who reads or plays Delver. You can also find me. You can always find me on social media at Hexplore Publishing or at Hexplore RPG. Please get in touch. Matt, I want to thank you again for the opportunity to be here and talk about Delver and my other works. And if your listeners are interested, they can find me at Drive Through RPG at Hexplore Publishing. They can find me on X, Twitter at Hexplore RPG, and I have a YouTube channel at Hexplore RPG. And that's it. That's it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Please, I'm really, really happy to be able to get to talk to folks about Delver today. As far as my review for the game goes, I'll keep it short and sweet. As Louise explained, Delver is inspired by old school dungeon exploration with low magic, high lethality, and, simple, crisp rules. For folks who are into gritty, grim, dark games like Morkborg or Cairn or some of the old school dungeon delving classics, you're going to absolutely adore Delver. I myself love the system. I love how straightforward it is, how no fuss, no muss it is. Your character has 4 stats, there's no skills, you start the game with no magic and very low HP. So it's really all about diving into the dungeon, trying to survive, and trying to fight to live another day. Now, that can be a benefit or a negative, depending on the kind of game you're looking to play. So the one caveat I'm going to make sure people know going into this is that if you're not looking for this kind of game, you're not going to have a good time. If you're looking for high fantasy, if you're looking for high survivability, if you're looking for something with a lot of crunch, Delver probably isn't going to be what you're looking for. But I would say that I'm the kind of person that normally prefers games that are, less dungeon delvy and more narrative focused. But Delver really did it for me. It felt low commitment because of how simple and light the rules are. Like I said, you're starting the game off with no magic, but that doesn't mean magic doesn't exist. The game has a really satisfying loop where you delve into the dungeon, you try to survive, and if you make it out, you're going to come out of there with some awesome equipment, some cool magic spells that you can invest into your character. But because it's low commitment and because it's high lethality and simple to play, you don't feel too bogged down by all the rules. If your character dies, they die, and that's the end of it. And it's not this big, it's not this, you don't feel like you made this big, long commitment and kind of have this like sour taste in your mouth. It's kind of the opposite. It's quick, it's simple. So I really, really can't recommend Delver enough. Like I said, it's a simple game, it's fun, and it truly encapsulates the simple joy and fear of delving into a dungeon and that push your luck of one more floor. So I hope everybody gives Delver a chance. A link is going to be found down below in the description. And once again, thanks Louise over at Hexplore Publishing for sharing a copy with me. I hope you all go give it a look. And we're back. Thanks to future me for doing that indie showcase, and thanks to whoever the indie creator was. There'll be links for the game that you can purchase in the show notes of today's episode, so whether that be on YouTube or podcast land, and it'll be an affiliate link. So if you want to explore that game, and you also buy it, a small kickback is going to come to me. So I encourage you to do it that way, if at all possible. But anyway, Ryan, we're back, and we're talking about Mega Dungeons. And I think now is the time to talk about, advice for running Mega Dungeons. Advice for somebody who's they've finished mapping out their dungeon. They've finished figuring out all of the interesting things that there are to figure out. Or maybe they've cracked open, a source book and they have the Mega Dungeon all figured out already for them, and they just have to read through it. But that's definitely not where the job of the Dungeon Master ends. Now we have to run our players through this thing.
Yes, we do.
And I'm sure that it must present its own set of unique challenges. So I'd be curious to know, kind of first and foremost, what were some of the things that surprised you when you were running your first Mega Dungeons, or when you were running one of these Mega Dungeons that you prepared and showcased through Red Quills? What were some of the things that your players did, or the way that they engaged with the mega dungeon that shocked you, surprised you, had you, you had to think a little faster to fill in the blanks, perhaps, or did that happen at all?
That's uh, my players can always surprise me, and I think anyone's
Definitely.
players can always. If you have a group that has never once surprised you, then there's something very wrong with that. They won't necessarily come up with what you would consider to be like the most elegant, most intelligent solution, because you're designing the problem. You automatically know what the solution to this is, and I always expect them to solve it in a particular way. They do it maybe about 40% of the time. Other times they tend to surprise me. That being said, it's important, I think, from a psychological perspective to understand like how your players respond to pressure,
Yeah.
because that's a really big part of sending them through a very stressful area. Is if they panic under pressure, if the players panic under pressure and the characters don't panic under pressure, then you've got a problem as a game master, because they're going to make stupid decisions. They're not going to be able to stop themselves panicking too much. So I think one of the things to be aware of is disconnecting the players a little bit, not too much, just a little bit from the level of pressure. They'll still feel it, but generally speaking, my guys have always surprised me with their willingness to negotiate, and I think it changes from group to group. My guys aren't murder hobos, and I know that is a big problem. My guys tend to avoid murder at all costs, which is great. I can work with that. I can work
Yeah.
with that a lot.
That actually speaks quite a lot to my current table as well. They're very willing to. Sometimes I think maybe neglect certain things that their characters might have not. Like, oh, this bandit's done some terrible things, but oh, he's a person, and we gotta be kind to them anyway. And it's like, okay, yeah, okay.
That's
Anyway,
great.
I interrupted you. Please continue.
No. I mean, it's an important thing to be aware of. Early on in my days in the DM, I did the trick that I think a lot of DMs do at some point, which is I would pepper the corpses of the people that they killed with little, like a note from his wife, or a drawing from his 3-year-old daughter. Thanks for becoming a bandit. I know it's very difficult to put aside your morals as as an ethical person and take on this risky job to support your family. We love you. And so my players learned their lesson very early on and started thinking about the consequences of their actions. That being said, if you create a dungeon, and this is a warning for everyone, if you create a dungeon that is everything that we've described so far, and if you think it is genuinely very interesting, then they will think that is genuinely very interesting. And the consequence of that is they're going to take their time, they're going to search everything, and they're going to have a lot of questions, which means that the amount of time they're going to spend in the dungeon is probably going to double. The more boring it is, the quicker you're going to go through it, which from a certain perspective is great. But it does mean that the more thought you put into it, the more thought you have to put into it. You mentioned keeping specific rooms clear later on so that you can fill them out as needed. I would say just be willing to just scrap plans and change them as you go through. And that's the benefit of not having prescribed fillings for dungeons. I think if you say, oh, this dungeon has to have these people in it, this person has to be here, blah, 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 then that's very difficult to do. But if you do, fall down a couple of levels and you think, oh, they're not ready for this, they were supposed to go through this area and this area, then you can change that up. But the problem I generally tend to encounter is we've been going through this for 5 sessions now. It was supposed to be 3 sessions. I'm getting really eager to move on to the next plot point, please, for the love of God. And so that tends to be the big problem I encounter with my groups is they tend to be so interested that they'll stop what they're doing and hyper focus.
Interesting. Yeah. So I guess knowing the people you're playing with is definitely super practical. Especially I think because a mega dungeon, it might be the first time you're running something like this for your players, so you might not fully be aware of how they're going to react in this kind of pressure cooker environment, right? It's going to be new to them, just as it's going to be new to you running it. I can't help but think about the like rest and recovery cycle in the game. I know that my players, they'll accept risk if there is something like a fire under their behind pushing them to accept it. Otherwise, they're smart. They're smart people and they play smart characters, and they're going to take every opportunity that they have to rest and recover and get their spell slots back and to get their, their daily powers back. So I'd be curious to know how rest and recovery factors into your design, but also into the way you run the dungeons so that you can keep pressure, you can keep the pressure elevated and when you want it to be, of course. So how would you go about doing that?
The rest cycle is a tough one. The most fun for a DM is making them afraid early on, so that they have to think about everything they do.
Mm-hmm.
If they are wandering through one of the wings and they try to take a short rest, they just encountered a kobold squad, 15 minutes before, killed all of them but one who escaped. That one's toddled off to his village, and as they're having a short rest, comes back with 3 more squads. If you introduce that kind of thing early on, then they're going to need to think every single time they take a rest in future. They will need to think about it, how they're going to barricade themselves, how they're going to keep themselves safe, because they don't get the benefits of that rest until the end. They don't get to spend hit points until they're sure that they haven't been disturbed for a full hour. Long rests, even worse, because if you've got a community of creatures within the dungeons, then chances are they're not all going to sleep at the same time. They've got a rotational watch as well. So the chances that you'll encounter any of them are the same throughout the entire 24-hour cycle, having a long rest. Yeah. They are going to patrol, especially if some of them died in the past. They want to make sure they know precisely where their enemies are. So that's something to keep in mind as well. I like rests. I particularly like rests when the players are grateful for them. So I think making them aware of how precious 8 hours together to sleep is something that you need to establish early on. The more grateful they are, the more that they will enjoy having their rest. And I think that will take away from the boredom of it. Risk takes away from the boredom. If they're running through and just killing people, and killing people is the only source of danger, then sure, that can get boring.
Definitely.
But not being able to sleep is a completely different kind of danger.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose too, this idea of having the dungeon be reactive is a lesson that perhaps the players will learn once and then get the idea, right? If you leave the dungeon to rest, when you come back, your progress is basically restarted. Maybe not fully restarted. Like you know a little bit more about the ecosystems and the factions at play, but there's going to be new barricades up. The traps are going to be reset, or new traps will be in their place. Maybe ambushes will be waiting for you, stuff like that. So
yeah, always. I think it's someone once described role-playing games as a game of chess where you play one side and your players play the other side. You have to do your best to get them as close to defeat as possible, that they think that when they win, it's their fault, or sort of their victory. But and I think that's a very good point. Whenever you are having a reactive dungeon, you do need to think about what the enemy would do. How would the enemy react to them going through this dungeon, being this danger? Yes, they would reset traps. Absolutely, they would move around in order to become less of a target. They would fortify themselves. But also, if they notice that a particular kind of trap does more damage to player characters, then they might set that trap more. They might deliberately make what appears to be a safe area for them to sleep so that they can ambush them later on. or perhaps they'll try to negotiate. There's all sorts of different ways that you can do it, and I think it's a lot of work. But the more reactive, more responsive, more complicated your world is, the more your players will reward you by thinking about consequences. My guys are fully aware of my rule of consequences, how things will come much, much later on. And so they are absolutely terrified. They are terrified of missing plot hooks. And one of them specifically took the keen mind feat in 5e because it allows him to turn to me and say, I've forgotten this guy's character's name. What's his name? What happened here? What was this book that we read? And I can just give them all of the information again, which is great for me because I spent ages making this campaign and I want them to remember it.
Man, that's actually a really interesting scenario because for me, there's something going on in my home game right now, and I'm going to try to be very spoiler free so that because I know some of my players listen. How's it going, Kyle? Anyway,
Hi, Kyle.
There's there's this intrigue happening right now in my game, and I very explicitly told my players to take notes because usually I'm quite liberal when they ask me, like, hey, we know this, right? Like, can you re-explain it to me? And I tell them. But in this particular instance, there's quite a lot going on. And I can't remember what level of detail has been provided to them for each of these moving parts. So I've gone ahead and told them, I said, I'm unfortunately not going to be able to answer your question. Like, when you ask me about something that happened in the past, I'm not going to be able to tell you because I'm not going to be able to remember specifically what piece of intel you obtained. Which has been hard. It's been hard on me. I feel kind of like an asshole doing that, to be honest. But I kind of forget my point. But it's kind of cool that your player is that invested that they took that feat just to be able to kind of ask you those things and get that information from you. Going back to mega dungeons and advice for running them, I kind of want to talk about something that I'm not too fond of, and that's kind of inventory management. I get the feeling that mega dungeons, they're kind of a survival game to a certain degree. You're far away from stores and shops, and you can't buy rations and extra arrows and stuff like that. Do you track those kinds of things in your game regularly?
Yes, we do track them. It doesn't come up very often, if I'm being honest.
Even in the context of the mega dungeons, like they always have enough to go around?
My players all have specific interests in terms of role playing games, and we've been playing long enough that I'm aware of what those interests are. The keen mind player is just an absolute lore bin. He loves the lore. He loves everything about the lore. If I print something off and it's got words about the world written on it, he puts it in his little folder so that he can read it later. He loves the lore, which is great because I can rely on him to tell the other two anything that I've mentioned within the last 20 sessions. Another one of them is all about tactics and combat tactics and negotiating with people and figuring things out long term for them and their benefit in the world around, which is great because he'll think about how their interactions have long term. And the third one is really into making sure they are alive tomorrow. And she will track the rations and the supplies and all those kinds of things. Not long ago, I started saying, look, I need everyone to start tracking weight. I need you to start tracking weight. Maybe because of one player who would collect everything he could get his hands on, which is fine with that. But if you start dragging 240 pounds of material through a dungeon, we're going to have to be aware of that and take that into account.
Definitely. I have a player. I haven't run a game for him in a long time, but we play in a couple of different games, and We are players together, and he's this kind of person too. And the game master for that game had to, I'm pretty sure, create weight management rules exclusively for him. Because he was carrying all kinds of stuff. He was carrying at one point like 5 bear traps in his like backpack, and he's like, I don't know, 5 bear traps are gonna fit in a backpack. Anyway, I'm sorry. Please keep.
No, it's that's an important point. At a certain point, like I don't really care about tracking out. Thankfully, none of my guys have a bow and arrow, which is great. So I don't have to worry about arrow tracking. So it's not even on my radar. It's not a huge problem. But this, my guy has, full enchanted bronze plate. He's got a shield. He's got a spear. He picked up another sword. He picked up 2 more short swords. He picked up 16 daggers. He starts walking around like a human porcupine with all of these various, sharp things. And yes, it is something that you need to be aware of, because if you're wandering through a mega dungeon and you clatter as you walk, then be aware that something's going to be aware of that. The more reactive you make the world, the more things that the world has to react to.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings us back to what you were talking about I think, getting to things like rations.
Yeah, exactly. Because I feel like it's an important part, right? It feels like an element of the game that is especially relevant. Let's say that. It's a part of the game that feels relevant when you're underground. You've been underground maybe for like a week and a half. Like that's going to be hard on you.
Anyway,
so
my survivalist player, she tends to keep that. She also plays a Goliath, which is very handy for her because her carrying capacity is twice that of everyone, because of her rate. So she sticks everything in a big barrel, slings the barrel onto her back, and so she makes sure whenever she goes into a dungeon that she's got at least a week's rations for everyone.
Cool.
Which is great. I don't need to worry about that. But if I want something interesting to happen, it does give me an opportunity. Because if she's wandering around with a bunch of rations, she goes to sleep at some point, and a giant rat comes in, gorges itself, then they suddenly don't have any rations. And while keeping track of rations over the long term can be interesting for a particular kind of player, most of the time they won't worry about it until everything's gone. It's like hit points. You're not really worried so long as you have some. It's when you have none that problems start occurring. At which point they'll need to find somewhere to get supplies. Water is the important, I think. Food's one thing, rations are one thing. You can find them. Any living thing has to eat something, and any living thing has to drink something, and it's much harder to carry water than it is to carry food.
Mm-hmm.
So that was something that, for instance, in the dragon one, the water was cursed. They drank the water. It was mixed with the congealed blood of an ancient dragon, and they started turning into draconic abominations over time, which I warned them about. As long as you warn them about that, that's great. If you say, oh, they're wandering around and they appear to be turning into dragons, they believe the water gives them powers. And then they say, I want to drink the water. You're like, well, I've warned you.
Yeah, I told you.
You get what you get at this point. Generally, though, I don't tend to worry about them too much, mainly because they are already on top of it. I think you can sprinkle those kinds of problems in, but that's something you need to sort out with your players. If they don't want to worry about where food and drink and stuff comes from, then I don't think it's something that you should be forcing on them. You're supposed to all have fun.
Yeah, I think that's really the crux of it. Is you're here to play the game, and perhaps it becomes an interesting challenge to overcome in one instance, even if you were never tracking food, even if you were always under the assumption that you had food. Throwing in a scenario where, like, oh, you know what, this scenario, the giant rat's eaten all your food, or some critter has poisoned your water. Now what do you do? And it just becomes another challenge, perhaps, to overcome. And then once they've found their solution, you stop caring about it again. But it could be part of it. All right, I have one more question for you as it pertains to advice. And
go on, hit me.
This is for the game masters out there who are very narrative very role play focused.
Mm,
When I asked this, this poll, I sent it out there for the internet. A few folks mentioned something along the lines of, I've never really run a mega dungeon before. I might be interested in
mm,
trying, but I'm worried about it because I like to run a very story-driven, role-play focused game. And
mm,
I think that our conversation so far has done a pretty good job of portraying a mega dungeon as being a place where story can still happen and narrative can definitely still happen. I'd be curious to know if you had thoughts or reassurances that you might be able
mm.
to provide to some of these players who, or rather, some of these game masters who are more narrative focused, role play focused, and are worried that a mega dungeon might detract from that or might not enable them to play the same kind of game with their table.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's. I think this is another area in which I should reassure everyone listening that mega dungeon is a misnomer.
Mm.
Don't allow yourself to think of it as a tomb necessarily. It can be, but it certainly doesn't have to be a tomb. It's much more interesting if it has living denizens in it, especially if one of those is ostensibly much friendlier than the others so that you can interact with them, you can negotiate with them as you
Mm-hmm,
go
mm-hmm.
through. I mean, even a lot of like the Yawning Portal ones have living denizens. You can get guides, you can have allies, you can do fetch quests for them. And the larger the mega dungeon is, the more of these various factions it can support. Any enclosed self-contained adventure area is a mega dungeon and you approach it from a particular light. And I think you can
Mm.
use that for any kind of role play. If you want to bring more role play into it, I mean, certainly you can have those factions. You can start bringing in traveling NPCs. A rival, party is always a fun way to do that. A roving trader who moves between different areas. You can encounter him on the path or in the various areas themselves is a great way to do it. But bringing role play into it, a very quick and easy way of doing that is to have the party be hired to guide someone through the mega
Oh,
dungeon.
cool. Yeah.
I mean, that's super easy way of bringing some role play straight to the fore. You've got an immediate plot hook. They've got a quest. Even if they're not particularly interested in the dungeon at first themselves, then they have something to tell them through it. And then you can add things further in. The person they're guiding is supposed to be delivering an artifact to the far side of the dungeon. They die halfway through, which is, very sad. But it means that the players now they've got to fulfill the quest. They
Mm-hmm.
have a sudden and overriding impulse that attracts them to a specific part of the dungeon. They have their own quest. They have some emotional stakes there. They have some role play capability. Once they get to the destination, they have to explain what's happened.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
think the feeling that a mega dungeon doesn't know is more oriented towards combat than role play is just a side effect of the mega dungeons that you see in popular media, and as it does not necessarily at all need to represent the mega dungeons that you run in your own campaign.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. I want to echo everything you just said, and I think historically, mega dungeons have this reputation, right? They have this reputation of being this crypt of some ancient necromancer who you have to get to the bottom and kill everything in every room, otherwise it's going to kill you. So
Mm,
I really love that idea of making sure that it's clear that there's a lot of denizens in there that you can interact with, have factions that you can interact with. There's a lot of room for intrigue in these spaces because there's definitely going to be turf wars or
yeah,
factions that want to have protection over something else. Motivations, right? These groups aren't hiding 50, 60, 100 feet under the ground for their entire life without a reason for being down there.
mm,
So if you can think of those motivations, I like your that wizard who was seeking power to become a dragon. That's super cool. He's got all kinds of motivation to stay there and make that happen. And interacting with that character would be a lot of fun, I think. So
Mm.
having these kind of eccentric, not necessarily evil, not necessarily uh, combat focused NPCs can still be had in a mega dungeon. So
Mm.
that's a lot of fun. Awesome, cool. I that covers all the questions I had for you, Ryan. I don't know if you had any parting words or last thoughts that you might
Look,
have.
last thoughts is the same as I do on any of my videos, which is I can't wait to see what everyone comes up with. I will be hanging around your streams, Matt, to see this episode when it comes up and see what people say about it. I would love to hear any ideas that people have had. I think that this is a topic that is really, really interesting. And I'm so keen to be involved in the community. Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's been a lot of fun. I know Mega Dungeons, they've been something that I personally have been kind of intentionally not including in my games because I've always felt this little seed of doubt. But I think, after talking to you about this, I feel motivated to maybe plan my own and run my own. So we'll see what happens, and I'll definitely keep you in the loop. And then, of course, yeah, when the episode comes out, I hope folks reach out, let us know what kind of cool Mega Dungeons they've been running. If you wanted to reach out, if we wanted to reach out to you, Ryan, how should people do that? Where can they find you? Where can they watch your content and all that good stuff?
YouTube's the best place to watch what I'm creating. I come out with at least one video a week, generally speaking. I've just started a Red Quills map making Discord. I can share the link with you, Matt, as well. And
Yeah, definitely.
I'm going to try to get more involved in the community there. I'm not very good at it. I tend to just hyper focus on my maps for several hours at a time. I forget the rest of the world exists. So I'm going to try to be more involved. But generally speaking, you can comment on YouTube videos. You can watch what I've got there. You can talk to me on Discord. I'm on Instagram and TikTok as well. Not as much, but just look up the Red Quills and it'll come up.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, cool. So I'll have all that stuff linked in the show notes for folks who are curious. I definitely recommend that you all go give Ryan a follow. It's a lot of cool content there for sure. If you wanted to reach out to me, you guys all know how to do that. That's at roll_play_chat on Instagram, Threads, X. Those are mostly the places where I'm active. I think I have a Blue Sky account that I literally never look at. So if you're trying to reach out to me there and I'm ignoring you, it's because I'm ignoring everyone on Blue Skies. I think I forgot my password, to be quite honest. But or if you don't want to be, subject to a character limit, you can always email me, as you know, contact roleplaychat@gmail.com. Thank you so much, Ryan, for being here to talk about Mega Dungeon. It's been a pleasure. It truly has.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been great.
Cool. Yeah, my pleasure. And folks, hope you all have a good one. Let's call it a chat. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of today's episode, friends. If you made it all the way here, you are one of the true MVPs of the Roleplay Chat audience. The other MVPs of the Roleplay Chat audience are the Patreon subscribers who are supporting me through their subscription on Patreon. I'd like to thank Domil's Wondrous Works and Jason over at Shadowmane. Thanks to the two of you for supporting me. Your support allows me to continue to make this show. If you wanted to join them, you're welcome to do so by going onto Patreon and looking for Roleplay Chat. There's also a link down in the show notes. There you can subscribe to the show where you can get access to the episodes as soon as they're done, as well as extended episodes depending on the tier that you subscribe to. You can also support the show without spending money. You can do that by reviewing the show, spreading the good word, and sharing the show with your friends. If you do that, it really helps to broaden the reach of Roleplay Chat. Recommendations, personal recommendations, and word of mouth really are one of the number one ways for the podcast to be discovered. Also, if you're looking to buy some new tabletop RPG stuff, like dice, miniatures, or new games and rules and supplements, the show notes have links to affiliate links. So if you were to buy things using those affiliate links, for instance, the indie showcase that was spotlighted in today's episode, you can purchase it there, sometimes at a discount too, depending on the link, and a small kickback comes back to me. So yeah, check all that stuff out. The show notes has a handful of links there, things like Hero Forge, Drive-Thru-RPG, some awesome dice makers and things like of that nature. So go check it out, and yeah. Thanks again for making it all the way here, and one last thank you to Alex and Chase over at Pocket Bard for allowing me to use their music for the intro and outro of Roleplay Chat.